We
are
cultivate.
cultivate.
We are cultivate.
Hello and welcome to a special mini-sode of Ye Olde Crime, the show where Maddie and I discuss the funny, strange, and obscure crimes of yesteryear every Wednesday. This special bi-weekly segment is called Can You Crack the Cramp-Word, which is slang for a difficult or obscure term, which I thought was very fitting. And joining me today is Kim from the A Good Night for a Murder podcast. And before we begin, I'd like to give her the opportunity to tell us a little more about herself and her show before we get started.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. So, my name is Kim. I host a podcast called A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. I cover Victorian true crime. I've been doing the podcast for about a year. It's in season 2. I release episodes every other week, and in them, I cover usually a true crime case from somewhere in the world. A lot of them are American and English, and sometimes, Scotland, Australia, we're all over the place. Each episode focuses on usually one true crime. I've covered Jack the Ripper, Lizzie Borden, the Texas servant girl murders, as well as some lesser known cases. I focus on one case per episode. I also have a Victorian society tip at the top of each episode, which is usually something about Victorian living or lifestyle. I also produce bonus content that accompanies each episode. So that is available exclusively on Patreon. I'm also on Patreon. If you want to listen to the bonus content, you can join there. And it's just a continuation of the discussion of the regular episodes. And you can also find me on Instagram and TikTok and now YouTube.
Awesome. Perfect segue. As you mentioned, your show focuses on Victorian crimes.
Yes.
What drew you to this particular period in history?
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of people just find the Victorian era fascinating, and I do as well. I think a lot of people romanticize it for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, and there was just so much like weird quirkiness that surrounded the Victorian era. They
Yes.
were kind of macabre as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, they love a morning ritual and all that sort of thing. So, and that's kind of my jam. I also enjoy like learning about paranormal and that
Yep.
sort of thing. And sure, and if you visit any of these historical places, it's always like a Victorian ghost that haunts.
Yes.
It always harkens back to the Victorian era. And so I would go to those places and I would learn about that. I would read about it online and I would want to know like the true story, like behind this haunting. Like, is there any
Sure.
sort of like truth that comes with it? And a lot of the time, sometimes this information is like a Google search away, or, just like the findagrave.com is like my ride or die source. There's like a ton of good information on there. And I would check that. And sometimes I would find that, yes, these claims were like founded and sometimes they were not. And I would
Mhm.
be upset that I didn't get the true story. And I'm like, well, I could tell that story. So I guess I kind of created the kind of content I wanted to listen to
Sure.
in the podcast. So, again, and I just think that the Victorian era is so fun and quirky and we really romanticize it, but also there's a lot of like darkness that goes on in there.
Yes.
And I think we need to remember that, right?
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people gloss over. I feel
Yes.
like when they talk about the Victorian era is just how like morbid things were, but how people were okay with how morbid things were.
Yeah, it was an interesting time. I mean, people were very, like close to death, and
Mhm.
it was very interesting. And there was a lot of rules and rituals for like how women were treated and how children were treated. And I think that if we are not careful
Yep.
and we don't learn from that, like sometimes it seems like we've come so far, and then it seems like we haven't advanced at all.
Yep.
So I just think it's also a very interesting period, particularly like in American history and in English history as well.
For sure. Also, as you mentioned, I love the fact that you include a segment at the top where you talk about, like Victorian style, like life and etiquette.
Yeah.
Where do you find your information for that, and kind of what inspired you to include that in your episodes?
Yeah, that just kind of came to me one day. I was thinking about how I wanted to structure the episodes, and I think that it was probably inspired by something on like social media. Again, like kind of like your segment with like Victorian slang we should bring back. I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people have seen that type of post. When I kind of started thinking about the podcast and I started to like do an Instagram and TikTok, and those got a lot of conversation going.
Mm-hmm.
People love to talk about the morning rituals and things that they had in their everyday lives, like their cosmetics and just in their
Mm-hmm.
homes and in their pantries that could very well kill you. And it was just
Mm-hmm.
like really weird, crazy stuff. We all have, well, not all of us, but I think that a lot of people are fans of Downton Abbey. They're fans of
Yep.
Bridgerton. Yeah. And all of those shows. And just like the ritual that they have in those shows, I think that's just so fascinating. So I wanted to kind of include that. And I try to relate it to the story that's going on.
Yep.
If it's a story that involves nursing, I have one that was like rules for nurses, rules for teachers. And they're very funny. Some of them, they didn't age well normally. They're definitely crazy. One of the most recent ones featured an episode was for springtime. It's time to promenade. It's promenade season. The Victorians would
I
just
listened to that one. Yep.
Thank
Yep.
you. Yeah, the Victorians just like would dress up and walk around the park, and that was, but there was rules to it, right? Like you can't
Yep.
just go out and promenade and talk to anyone you want. The courting rules are crazy, the marriage rules are crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you want to live like a Victorian, if you're into that and that's your scene, I thought I'd help you out with the tips at the top of the episodes.
It was crazy.
Yeah.
Like just all the rules and regulations of just essentially walking in a circle in a park. Like
I
it's
know.
just, it was like, as you were going through it, I was like, I would have forgotten half of this stuff before I even got outside. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, yeah. It was just part of their lifestyle. Like a lot of folks also know about the Victorian language of flowers and how that means something.
yep.
And we do it to this day when you're choosing a bouquet for like a wedding or like a celebration or a funeral, even. It all kind of harkens back to that. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I just think the Victorians were so bored. They just made up.
They made up a bunch of
especially
stuff.
yeah especially the upper classes, they didn't have to work so much, so they just made up all these crazy rules, and everyone was just got on board. They're like, oh yes, we should do that, it makes sense. So
Yep,
yeah.
totally. Another thing that you've created is a map where all the grave markers
Yeah.
are located for the people, victims, and murderers alike on your show.
Yes.
Do you have any issues finding some of them?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so the map is fairly new, but to be honest, I'd been kind of making my own map, kind of for years. I do enjoy visiting cemeteries. I just
Mm-hmm.
enjoy wandering around them. I think they're beautiful, even if nobody famous is buried there.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned before already the website findagrave.com. I believe it's mostly like volunteer run in there, and they do a really great job of documenting
Mm-hmm.
a lot of like cemeteries, but some of them are not so great. So, just like for example, we were looking one time, my friend and I, for the radium girls.
Yes.
Yeah, so they're kind of Victorian era adjacent, but they died from, radium poisoning. And
Mm-hmm.
so all we knew about them was kind of the section they were buried in. And that's honestly a lot more than we usually get. So you do your best with the maps and everything like that you have. I like when there's photos of the grave, even if I can find like one photo of a grave, because then I can look in the background and stand in the cemetery and turn around. And maybe you look a little silly. You have to be careful not to interrupt any
Exactly.
any
Yeah.
other mourners or any other visitors or anything like that. But yeah, it's always fun to do a little bit of a cemetery safari. Some of these marked graves, some of these graves are completely unmarked. So,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's just you're going to go there and see what you can find.
My follow-up question to that is, how amazing are Victorian gravestones?
Oh,
I
they're
mean,
so amazing. Yeah.
like the different like iconography associated with them, how like the different symbols meant different things, and
Yes. Yeah. I have a book when I go out of symbolism on gravestones that I kind of just like consult whenever I see something interesting. I want to do I don't know if it's going to be a tip or just something on social media. They had like trends as far as gravestones. Like for a while, the zinc grave markers became a big deal. I don't know if you know about them. So they're not stone, they're actually made of zinc, and they were really affordable and they look exactly like stone and they age really well. Like if you go to cemeteries now, they're like lighter, kind of like a light blue silver color.
okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're interesting. And I don't know if it's because they were cheaper, but people tended to write more on them. So you can,
Yes.
you learn a little bit about like the person's life, or sometimes they have why they died on there. And it's really interesting. So I want to do an episode or maybe a society tip about like grave trends. You know, they had trends to keep them from grave robbing.
Yep.
And, you know, they had different flowers for mother, flowers for a younger person. So yeah, I just like hanging out in cemeteries and visiting them. There's a lot interesting going on there.
I found it very interesting how some of them would also, like, instead of just saying how old somebody was, they break it out into like days, like how many
Right.
years and months and days old the person was. And that was like fascinating to me to like see that as one of the different things that they would do on there. And yeah, some of them would have poems associated, especially if it's a child, you know, like a poem that makes them think of the person who passed away, or yeah, they would include what illness they died from.
Yeah, a lot of times well, not a lot of times, but one of the trends that they had was like graves that looked like trees or tree stumps or like logs,
Yes.
if you've seen those.
Yes.
Yeah. And you know, just fun trends. It's interesting. And
Yeah.
obviously things have changed now, right? Because things look very different. We have hearts, we have angels, we have all sorts of different things that I don't know why we got away from writing like the full date. Maybe, you know, it had to do with affordability or space, or, you know, sometimes, you know, children didn't live as long and you could only write a couple of days or weeks,
Yep.
you know, on a headstone, and they just carried that over for everybody else. Maybe it's faith-based, but yeah, like, see, I just like learning about all that. It's very interesting to me.
Yeah. It's really cool.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kim, and I host a Victorian true crime podcast. In Season 1, I covered the true stories behind notorious cases like H.H. Holmes, Madame Delphine LaLaurie, Jack the Ripper, and more. I also covered lesser-known but equally fascinating cases such as Dr. Crippen, the first murderer to be caught by the aid of wireless telegraph, and George C. Parker, the con man who made his living selling the Brooklyn Bridge. And now, A Good Night for a Murder is back for Season 2. Join me for Season 2, where we'll talk about vindictive housemaids, Black Widow killers, wicked Victorian doctors, missing socialite scandals, and more. Follow along on Instagram or TikTok at A Good Night for a Murder, and subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Well, that's the end of my questions. So are you ready to move on to the slang term portion of the interview?
I'm ready. I'll try hard.
Okay. Your first term is Joe Blake the Bartlemy.
The Bartlemy?
So Bartlemy. Bartlemy.
Oh boy. Okay. I've heard you use them in sentences before. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. May I?
After a night of drinking, Fred decided to Joe Blake the Bartlemy.
Oh, geez. Okay. So things you do after a night of drinking.
Or not. It's I would say it's more of a nighttime activity.
Oh, okay.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be a nighttime activity.
Say the whole phrase one more time, please.
Joe Blake the Bartlemy.
There's like a lot of people in this phrase, Joe and Blake and Bartlemy. I don't know.
Yep.
I don't know any of them. Oh. I'm going to guess that it means that he raided the refrigerator. A Bartlemy is obviously a slang for a refrigerator.
Totally. Everyone knows that.
To Joe Blake something, you're really going to go to town on it. Like, you know, you're going to Joe. What does it mean? Just tell me.
I kind of like how you said you go to town on it, because Joe Blake the Bartlemy is when you visit a low woman.
Oh my. Okay. I don't think I was that far off. I think interesting. So
you're going to town on something.
So so it's a booty call.
It's essentially a booty call, yes.
Oh, but like not someone that was they respect.
Yes.
Rude. Okay.
I know.
We want to stay away from those.
Yeah, so don't Joe Blake the Bartlemy. That's just rude.
It really is. All right. Okay.
Your second term is kixies. So like kick and then SIES.
Kixies. Okay. May I have it in a sentence?
Yes. James was very excited to wear his new kixies to school.
Okay. So, it sounds very literal. I think sometimes like Occam's razor, like the most obvious explanation is the one. I could talk it to death. I was like, oh, just for kixies, just for fun, just for, but if you're going to wear your kixies to school, I think it means like your kicks, like your sneakers, your shoes. Kixies are shoes.
You're very close. Kixies are trousers.
Trousers. Oh, they didn't
Mhm.
know what they were talking about then.
No. Obviously, they have no idea that we call shoes kicks now, but
Right. That's so funny.
yeah.
Is it like a
So
style? Is it like an upper class style, or is it like a,
I don't know. Let's
could be
see.
anything. Like maybe they're short. I'm imagining like they're kind of like short, like cropped, so you can kick these things. There's probably not many Victorian photos on Google image results
No.
of kixies.
Yeah. So essentially, it just says it's British slang for trousers or pants.
Okay.
So
I'll
it
take
doesn't say necessarily what type of pants.
So what do you think they called shoes?
Did they call shoes? I don't know.
Your Woxies?
Your walks.
Dancies? I don't know.
Now I need to know. Well, I would like to thank Kim for joining me today for Can You Correct the Cramp-Word? And you mentioned it at the top, but before we go, can you tell our listeners one more time where they can find you on social media and when new episodes of your show come out?
No problem. The podcast is A Good Night for a Murder. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. I also have a website at agoodnightforamurder.com. The podcast comes out every other week.
Perfect. And on that note, as always, I'm Lindsay, and I'll see you next time with another tale as old as crime.